Welcome to Gear Talk. This is our 4th episode in our 8-episode series on 1 Samuel. Today, Brian Verrett talks about the priest-king theme in Samuel. Samuel promises that the Messiah will be a king, but Samuel also says that the Messiah will be a priest. Could this priest and king be the same person? They are, and in this podcast, we briefly go over Samuel's priest-king theme.
Welcome back to our 4th podcast in our series through Samuel. This is Brian here, and I'm so glad to be able to talk with you about the book of Samuel today. It's been funny that in our series on Samuel, our first 3 episodes were on Genesis, and we haven't even gotten to Samuel, but we can finally remedy that and move in toward the object of our study. So that's just wonderful. We've said all along that the aim of this series is for you to know that Samuel's point is that Jesus, the Messiah, is a priest king who will defeat the serpent and lead God's people into a new creation. And so we've tried to lay the groundwork so that way you can better see that in the book of Samuel. So in our 2nd episode, we went back to Genesis, and there we saw that Adam was a priest and a king and a failure. And we saw that ever since he failed to resist the serpent, we've been waiting for a priest king who would overcome the serpent. And who would be the one to do this? We learned in our 3rd episode that the Pentateuch is looking forward to a new Adam who would fix everything that the old Adam broke by his sin. This new Adam is also a new and better Noah and Eve's promised offspring, the one who would defeat the serpent. And like Adam, he will be a priest king. And like Noah, he would bring about a new creation. And now that we know what Genesis is anticipating, we are better able to pick up what Samuel is talking about whenever Samuel talks about this promised serpent slayer and priest king. So in this episode, we will learn who Samuel says is the promised priest king. We could do an entire series on just the priest king theme in Samuel. And the goal of this series was more to emphasize the serpent slayer. And so that's what we'll do in episodes 5, 6, and 7. Those will really focus on how Jesus is going to slay the serpent. And we could do so many episodes on just the priest king theme. So this is going to be a very abbreviated and cursory overview here. But I hope the Lord uses it nevertheless to be a blessing to you. So now it's time for us to turn our attention to Samuel and see who is this promised priest king, who is this new Adam who will make all things right. And we get our answer, or at least we start to get our answer, at the beginning of the book. It's common in biblical literature and all literature to lay out the important themes of a book in the beginning of the book. That's why we call it an introduction. It's introducing all the important parts of the material. And 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is no different. Remember, it's one big book, so I'll just say Samuel, but I mean 1 and 2 Samuel. And so here in 1 Samuel chapter 2, we really get critical information to know who is this promised anointed one, this promised priest, this promised king. And there's 2 verses in particular that we need to key in on. The first verse is 1 Samuel 2:10, and I'll read that for you here in a minute. And in that verse, the anointed one is the king. In the second verse, 1 Samuel 2:35, the anointed one is the priest. And so we have these 2 anointed ones. The first is a king, the first is a priest, and it's up to us to figure out, are they the same person or are they different? So I'm convinced they're the same person. The anointed one is the king, and he is the priest. And so we'll look at that now. So let me read for you and talk a little bit about this anointed king. So in 1 Samuel 2, we've got Hannah's beautiful prayer. You know, Hannah, the barren mother, well, formerly barren and then becomes mother, wife to Elkanah, and derided by her rival who had sons, and she made fun of Hannah. And Hannah prayed and prayed for a child, and God finally gave her a son. And so she named her son Samuel, which means God hears. God finally heard her prayer. And so she dedicates Samuel to the Lord. And so she prays to the Lord a prayer of thanksgiving in 1 Samuel 2. And in her prayer, she gives a series of examples of how God gives strength to the weak and raises up the destitute and brings down the rich and the powerful and brings low those who are arrogant and prideful in heart. And so in these first 10 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 2, her first example is herself. She says, "My strength is exalted in the Lord." She says, "Now that the Lord has given me a child, it's like my strength and my horn and my power is lifted up." And she gives other examples. She says, those who, like the barren woman, has 7 children. The poor is made rich. God makes those who are feeble strong. In all these ways, God is bringing up the lowly and bringing down the exalted. And her final example of God raising up the lowly, her final example of God bringing down the exalted, is in 1 Samuel 2:10, which talks about Jesus, the anointed one, the king we've been waiting for. So let me read that verse for you. "The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth." So there you see it. All the powerful enemies will be brought down. The adversaries will be brought down. And then the verse goes on. "He," that's the Lord, "will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed one." Here we see that God raises up the lowly a final time. God has to give strength to the king because the king is feeble. He has to exalt the power of the anointed one because the anointed one's power is not enough. The anointed king in this verse is one who has to go through suffering, and God will give him the strength and the power to endure through suffering victoriously. This king is called the anointed one, which is the same basic word for Messiah. This is a messianic king that we are waiting for. And there's a lot of reasons I can say that I think this is Jesus, but we sadly don't have time for those reasons. So here we have the anointed one, and the anointed one is God's king. God will give this king the power he needs to raise him up above all others. Next, we see and learn about how the anointed one is also a priest. And God tells us that this anointed one is also a priest through a prophet. This prophet comes to tell Eli and rebuke Eli that Eli has been honoring his sons more than the Lord. Eli does have some care for the Lord, but not enough. When Eli has to choose between making his sons stop disobeying or letting his sons continue to disobey, he continues to allow his sons to disobey. He does not put his foot down and make them stop. He would rather appease his sons' sinful practices than put his foot down and kick them out from the priesthood. And in this way, he dishonors the Lord. And God is sick and tired of this high priest and these 2 sons who would not honor the Lord. They would not glorify the Lord. And he is so sick and tired of it, he promises Eli that God promises Eli that God would not only destroy Eli's house, but also the house of Eli's father, whom God gave the priesthood when he brought them out of Egypt. This is surely Aaron and Aaron's household. God is promising in these verses to destroy the Aaronic priesthood. And the way he represents the future destruction of the Aaronic priesthood is by destroying Eli's house. He would destroy Eli's house in the short term to anticipate how one day Aaron's priesthood would be no more. And in the place of Aaron's priesthood, would come a new priesthood, not from the line of Aaron, but from the Messiah. 1 Samuel 2:35 says this. I'll read it, and then I'll tell you the translation problem. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed one forever. So here God is telling Eli, look, your priesthood is so wicked. You're such a wicked high priest. Your sons are so wicked. I'm just going to destroy it, burn it all to the ground, and make a new one. I'm going to have a new faithful priest, and he's going to do what's according to my heart and my mind. And I'm going to build him a sure house, or a faithful house. Sure and faithful are the same in Hebrew. And we're just going to replace it. And this faithful priest will go in and out before my anointed one forever. And that translation makes it sound like the faithful priest is not the anointed one. Let me read it again. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and in my soul. And I will build him a faithful house, literally faithful house, and he, the faithful priest, shall go in and out before my anointed one forever. But this is probably not the right way to translate this verse. Almost certainly, the better way to translate it is to say that the faithful priest is the anointed one. That the faithful priest is the anointed one. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind, and I will build him a faithful house, and it, the faithful house, shall go in and out before my anointed one forever. That's what God is saying. God is saying that the faithful priest is the anointed one, the Messiah, and that the house of the faithful priest, the lineage of the faithful priest, the descendants of the faithful priest would serve before the faithful priest and on his behalf forever. That an eternal priesthood under an eternal faithful priest would replace Aaron and Eli's house. Aaron had 2 sons, and they disobeyed because they did not honor the Lord, and so God killed them in one day. And again, we have Eli with his 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who are sleeping around and stealing the Lord's sacrifices for themselves, and none of them are honoring the Lord. And so God promised that just like Aaron's 2 sons died in the same day, so Hophni and Phinehas' sons would die in the same day. From beginning to end, the Aaronic priesthood has been a glory thief. They have not honored the Lord. And so God says, I've had enough. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest. And unlike Aaron's 2 sons, who were unfaithful, and unlike Eli's 2 sons, who were unfaithful, this faithful priest will have a faithful house. How do you know you belong to faithful Jesus? You are a faithful person. And what does this faithful priesthood underneath the faithful priest do? They serve. They go in and out before the anointed priest forever. This is Jesus. He is the one that we've been waiting for. And so 1 Samuel 2 lays out these 2 ideas. The anointed one is a king, and the anointed one is a priest. And I think within the context of 1 and 2 Samuel as a whole, it makes so much more sense to see that this anointed king and anointed priest are the same person. And so I'd like to just lay that out for you briefly in the rest of our time together, that Samuel is indeed looking for a faithful priest and a faithful king. So who is this promised anointed one? Well, in summary, before we move on, just know there's 4 things that we've already seen about him. First, he's a priest and a king. Second, he's a faithful man. Third, he will have a faithful house. And fourth, he's not from the line of Aaron. He's definitely not from the line of Eli. This is the one that we're looking for. And there's really only 4 options of who this person could be within the book of Samuel, like 4 characters doing things options-wise. The first is Eli, he's a priest. The second is Samuel, he's a priest. The third is Saul, he's a king. And the fourth is David, he's a king. Those are the priests and those are the kings that have major roles in the book of Samuel. They're the ones who could maybe be this promised priest king. So we'll start with Eli, and we'll just think through these four characters, and that'll help us better understand what the book of Samuel as a whole is all about. And it'll also help us better understand how Jesus is the promised priest king that we're looking forward to. So we'll begin with Eli. Eli has two things about him that I really want you to notice, and that would do you well to notice. First, and you might not realize this, but Eli acts like a king. Our English translations cover this up a little bit, but Eli acts like a king. He eats all day like a king, and there's even specifically king language used for him. So let me just read a verse here. 1 Samuel 1:9. After they, that's Hannah's family, had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. You could just as easily translate that verse to say Eli the priest was sitting on the throne beside the doorpost of the palace of the Lord. The idea is that the temple here is being called the Lord's palace. But who's sitting on the throne at the Lord's palace? It's not the Lord. It's Eli. The Lord has a palace. It is his temple complex. And yet Eli is sitting on a throne as if he has made himself God. Eli is sitting on a throne. And this is no throwaway idea that he's sitting on a throne. You remember how Eli dies? He hears the words, he hears the message that his two sons have died and that the Ark of the Covenant has been lost. And it says Eli fell over backward from his seat, or his throne, by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken and he died, for the man was old and heavy. There's so much we could say about this. But it would make a lot of sense that if Eli were sitting in a throne, exalting himself up to be like a king, that God would kill him from the throne. Remember, God brings down the exalted. You want to sit on a throne? Well, I will knock you off your throne, and you will fall to the ground, and you will die under your own glorious weight. That seems to be the idea. He's like a king sitting on a throne at a palace. He has commandeered Yahweh's temple complex and made himself out to more or less be God. And Eli has two wicked sons, and it's precisely because Eli and his two wicked sons are not properly honoring the Lord that we need the Messianic priest king to come. It's because of Eli's unwillingness to rebuke his sons that God told him, I will tear down the whole I will tear down the priest complex and replace it with a Messianic priest king. So these are these two key ideas, that when the priest acts like a king, God kills him. And God wants a new priesthood because of the two wicked sons. These are the two huge ideas in the book of Samuel. Priests are not kings. And Eli has two wicked sons. Two huge ideas. If God does not like a priest acting like a king, then they are not the promised priest king. And if a man has two wicked sons, then he is not the promised priest king, because the promised priest king would have a faithful house. When Eli acts like a king, God kills him. And Eli has two wicked sons, so he does not have a faithful house, and he cannot be the promised priest king. Next is Samuel, the prophet Samuel. Maybe he's the priest king. He's a priest serving the Lord faithfully. And he's a judge. That's kind of like a king, right? Well, it's amazing that as soon as Samuel starts acting like a king, he takes a back seat in the story. So let me read you just a few verses. 1 Samuel 8, 1, 2, and 3. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Samuel here is passing on his judgeship to his sons. Samuel here is saying, since I'm judge, I will pass down the judgeship to my sons. That's like what kings do. Kings pass down the kingship to their sons. Samuel is passing down the judgeship to his sons as though he were taking on some kingly authority. And notice also that Samuel has how many wicked sons? 2. His firstborn Joel and his secondborn Abijah, he made judges, or wanted to at least, and they did not walk in his ways. It is like Abijah and Joel are like Hophni and Phinehas, Eli's 2 wicked sons. Samuel cannot be the promised priest king. He has 2 wicked sons. He does not have a faithful house. And when Samuel starts acting like a king, immediately the people reject him and they say, Samuel, we don't want your sons to judge over us. We want a king. We want a king. We want a king. We'll learn more later on about why they want this king. But for now, just notice that Samuel also acts like a king and has 2 wicked sons, and he gets rejected. Next comes Saul. But instead of Saul being a priest who acts like a king, Saul is a king who acts like a priest. And as soon as Saul acts like a priest, God says, basically, Saul, I'm done with you. So maybe you remember this story, 1 Samuel 13. Saul is told to wait 7 days for Samuel to show up, so that way Samuel could make some offerings. And then, after making these offerings and seeking the Lord's help, they would fight the Philistines and have success. But Saul did not wait for Samuel. And so Saul said, in verse 9 of 1 Samuel 13, bring the burnt offerings here to me and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And as soon as he finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and greet him. And Samuel said, what have you done? And Saul said, when I saw the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord, so I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. And now, what happens next is that Samuel is a prophet, rejecting Saul. Once again, just like the Lord sent a prophet to reject Eli, now the Lord has sent Samuel to reject Saul. So Samuel says, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man according to his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept the command, what the Lord commanded you. Isn't that amazing? That as soon as Saul acts like a priest, God says, I'm taking the kingdom away from you. It's because Saul is not the promised priest king. And the promised priest king is not to come from Saul's line. Just like the promised priest king is not to come from Samuel's line, and just like the promised priest king is not to come from Eli's line. Because the promised priest king will not come from Eli or Samuel or Saul, as soon as they start acting like priest kings, God pulls the rug out from underneath them and humbles them and says, you're not all that. You're not fit to be occupying 2 offices. You're a priest or a king, but you're not both. And as soon as you think you're bigger than you are, I will humble you, because I am the God who brings down the exalted. And just like Samuel had 2 wicked sons, and just like Eli specifically had 2 wicked sons die in the same day, Saul has 2 sons die in the same day that are wicked. Finally, Saul dies at the very end of 1 Kings. In 1 Kings 31, Saul dies to the Philistines. And in that same day, 3 of his sons die: Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. Jonathan is righteous, but I highly doubt Abinadab and Malchishua were. Much like Eli had 2 sons die to the Philistines on the same day, so now Saul is having his 2 wicked sons, Abinadab and Malchishua. These sons had not aligned with David. They stayed faithful to Saul. Now Saul's 2 sons, who refused to align with David, are dying on the same day. Saul is like Eli, and God is bringing him down. And the final king is David. Could David be the priest king that we are waiting for? Could David be the hero of the story? And the answer, at first, looks like yes. David brings the ark into the Lord in 2 Samuel 6. Perhaps you remember this story, where he's dressed up in linen ephod, dressed up in linen garments, and I think he might even be wearing the ephod. Yeah, wearing a linen ephod. He's dressed up like a priest. That's what that means. He's dressed up like a priest, and he's dancing and offering sacrifices, and yet for some reason, the Lord does not rebuke David. In fact, the Lord honors David. Instead of tearing the kingdom away from King David when he acts like a priest, God extends the kingdom to David forever in the very next chapter, 2 Samuel 7. And God makes a covenant with David and says, "You shall forever have a son sitting on the throne." David is like a priest. David is a priest king, and God is okay with him. So much so that at the end of 2 Samuel chapter 8, the text actually says that Benaiah and the son of Jehoiada were over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were priests. David is a high priest, and his sons are priests underneath him. But remember, you're only the promised anointed one. You're only the promised priest king if you are faithful and you have a faithful house. And David does not remain faithful. In 2 Samuel 11, David sins with Bathsheba and murders Uriah, and he is not faithful. And as soon as David becomes unfaithful, his house becomes unfaithful. In 2 Samuel 13, through the end of the book, basically, are troubles that David has with his sons. And just like Eli had 2 wicked sons who died in the same day, and just like Saul had 2 wicked sons who died in the same day, and just like Samuel had 2 wicked sons, and just like all these men had 2 wicked sons, proving that they don't have faithful houses and that they can't be the faithful priest, David has 2 wicked sons. The name of the first is Amnon, and the name of the second is Absalom. Amnon abuses sexually his sister in the most vile, detestable ways possible. Amnon does things he ought not do with Tamar. And Absalom seeks revenge on behalf of his sister Tamar, kills Amnon like Cain killed Abel, seeks to take the kingdom from David, and is as traitorous and treasonous as they could possibly be. If the faithful priest and the faithful king are faithful and they're to have a faithful house, David is not him. David is not faithful. And as soon as David's faithfulness falls, the house of David's faithfulness falls. The house will only be faithful if the father of the house is faithful. We are still left waiting at the end of Samuel for a faithful priest with a faithful house who is a faithful king. It's not Eli. He had 2 wicked sons. It's not Samuel. He had 2 wicked sons. It's not Saul. Soon as he acted like a priest, God ripped the kingdom from him. And it's not David, because he also was not faithful, and he also had 2 wicked sons, just like Eli and Samuel and I would say even Saul. None of these men are the faithful priest and the faithful king. He will come from David's line, though. He will be the son of David. The son of David will bring about a faithful house because he will be a faithful priest king. And it is this faithful priest king in the book of Samuel who will defeat the serpent. And it's to this serpent-slaying faithful priest king that we will now start to turn in the next 3 episodes.
Thank you for joining us for Gear Talk. For additional resources related to other biblical texts, visit handstotheplow.org.